I walked outside at 6 a.m. with my coffee. There was a backhoe in my orchard. Not near it, in it. Diesel smoke, tire tracks through 50 years of root systems. A machine operator who wouldn't look at me. I walked straight up to the woman with the clipboard.
Get it out, now!
She smiled, didn't move, said,
Mr. Faulkner, you might want to read page 7 before you finish that sentence.
I'd never received any page 7. She knew that.
72 hours to comply. After that, we proceed with or without your cooperation.
I looked at the backhoe. I looked at her. I looked at the tree my grandfather planted in 1971, still standing, for now. Then I said, okay. She thought that meant she'd won. It meant I'd just started. What would you do? Drop a pin. Where are you watching from? My name is Garrett Faulkner, and I am not, by nature, a vengeful man. I say that up front because by the time this story ends, you might find that hard to believe. I grew up on the property, 42 acres in the foothills of Western Virginia, an hour east of nowhere, bordered on 3 sides by ridge timber, and on the 4th by a 2-lane county road with a cracked yellow center line. My grandfather, Earl Faulkner, bought the land in 1963 on a postal worker's salary and a second mortgage he never told my grandmother about until it was paid off. He spent the next 20 years turning the rocky, clay-heavy slope into something extraordinary. A working orchard that eventually supplied 3 local restaurants, a farm stand, and enough apple butter to give every neighbor on the road a jar every Christmas without fail. My father kept it going. I kept it going after him. The trees were old, productive, and deep-rooted in the kind of way that takes decades to build and about 40 minutes to destroy with the right machine. Here's what changed. About 6 years before any of this happened, a developer named Prescott Langley bought the 200 acres on the ridge directly above my property. He wasn't from here. He was from Atlanta, wore fleece vests in July, drove a white Range Rover that was always inexplicably clean, and he had ambitions. He built a planned community up there, 62 homes, a clubhouse, a lifestyle amenity package, which is developer speak for a pool nobody swims in and a pickleball court that causes more conflict than it resolves. The community was called Ridgecrest Estates, and it came with a homeowners association. The HOA board was chaired by a woman named Dorothea Vance. Dorothea Vance deserves her own paragraph. She was 61 years old, retired from a mid-level HR position at a logistics company in Roanoke, and she had arrived in Ridgecrest Estates with the energy of someone who had finally found a domain worthy of her administrative gifts. She wore a lanyard with her board president badge, even when she wasn't at official HOA functions. She had gotten the county assessor's office to resurvey her property line 3 times in 2 years, twice at no cost to her because she filed the requests as public interest corrections. She had blocked a road widening project because one of the proposed orange cones would temporarily sit 12 inches inside the HOA's recorded easement boundary. She was, in the technical sense, exactly the type of person the HOA system was designed to empower. Which is to say, she was exactly the type of person who should never have been given power in the first place. My first interaction with Dorothea came about 8 months before the backhoe showed up. She knocked on my door one October afternoon, the air sharp with the smell of fallen apples fermenting at the base of the trees, yellow jackets drunk on the sweetness, the gravel in my driveway crunching under her sensible shoes, and informed me, pleasantly but firmly, that Ridgecrest Estates had identified a stormwater management issue that required a drainage channel to be routed through the lower portion of my property. She had a letter, she had a map, she had a highlighter. I told her I'd look it over. She said she appreciated my cooperation. I hadn't offered any. I should have read that letter faster. I should have called a lawyer that same week. Instead, I set it on the kitchen counter under a coffee mug and went back to pruning. That decision cost me 11 trees and approximately 18 months of my life. But it also set in motion the most satisfying sequence of events I have ever had the pleasure of engineering. Let me give you the letter's argument, because it's important to understand how Dorothea operated, which was always with a veneer of total legitimacy. The letter claimed that Ridgecrest Estates had conducted a stormwater study. True, they'd hired a civil engineering firm from Charlottesville, and that the study identified my lower pasture as the natural drainage corridor for the ridge. The letter further claimed that under Virginia's common law of drainage, specifically the natural watercourse doctrine, Downstream landowners are obligated to accept surface water that naturally flows from uphill properties. That last part is real, by the way. Virginia does recognize the natural watercourse doctrine. Here's the thing, though. It applies to natural drainage patterns that already exist, not to engineered channels that are being proposed for the first time. There's a difference between water that runs downhill on its own and water that a developer has regraded an entire hillside to send in a new direction. Dorothea's letter treated those two things as identical. I still didn't call a lawyer. I wrote back instead, polite, firm, asking for the underlying engineering study, the specific statutory authority they were citing, and the survey documents establishing any easement over my land. Standard stuff. The kind of letter that takes you 45 minutes to write and communicates very clearly. I've done this before, and I'm not impressed. Her response came 12 days later, and it was a masterclass in bureaucratic escalation. She had not provided the engineering study. She had not provided statutory authority. What she had provided was a letter from the county's stormwater management office, signed by a deputy director named Phil Haskell, stating that the drainage project was consistent with county development guidelines, and that adjacent property owners should be prepared to accommodate necessary infrastructure improvements. That phrase, should be prepared to accommodate, is not a legal requirement. It is, however, exactly the kind of official-sounding language that most people read and immediately fold. Dorothea knew that. She was counting on it. I called my neighbor Walt Briggs that evening. Walt is 73, a retired civil engineer, and the kind of man who has kept every piece of paper he has ever received since approximately 1987. He came over with a thermos of bourbon-spiked coffee. It was November by then, and the air bit hard, the last apples clinging to the high branches like they knew something we didn't. And he read both letters slowly, sitting at my kitchen table. "That deputy director's letter means nothing," Walt said. "It's a courtesy notice, not an authorization. You own that land. They can't run a channel through it without an easement, and they can't get an easement without either buying it from you or condemning it through eminent domain. And a private HOA cannot initiate eminent domain." He was right, and that was important. But here's what I didn't know yet. Dorothea had already begun a separate process. While she was exchanging letters with me, she had filed an application with the county to have my lower pasture designated as a stormwater management facility. Under Virginia Code Section 15-2-2114, localities can require private landowners to maintain drainage infrastructure on their property if it's been designated as part of a municipal stormwater plan. If that designation went through, the calculus changed completely. I didn't find out about that filing for another 3 weeks. I found out because my neighbor on the other side, a woman named Cecily Drummond who grew lavender and kept bees and had a habit of attending every county planning meeting just because she liked knowing things, called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, casually, as if she were discussing the weather, "Garrett, I see your name on next month's planning agenda." I drove to the county offices the next morning. I pulled the application. I read it. And I felt, for the first time in this whole process, genuine cold anger. Dorothea had included photographs of my property in her application. Aerial photographs, taken from a drone, showing the natural low point of my lower pasture. She had annotated them with arrows and labels. She had submitted a drainage flow analysis, the engineering study she'd refused to send me, that modeled the entire ridge's stormwater as funneling through my land. More than that, in the application's narrative section, she had described my orchard as an agricultural operation in decline, with limited active management. She had suggested the designation would have minimal impact on current land use. 43 apple trees in active production, supplying 3 restaurants and 2 farmers markets, and she'd called it a declining operation. I read that phrase 3 times. Then I drove home, called an attorney, and started taking notes. The attorney's name was Breckenridge Cole, Breck to everyone who knew him, and he operated out of a converted Victorian in the county seat that smelled permanently of old coffee and wood polish. He was 64, had practiced land use law in this county for 35 years, and had the calm, unhurried manner of a man who had outlasted every adversary he'd ever encountered, simply by knowing more than they did and waiting longer than they could. Breck's first assessment was blunt. The designation application is aggressive but not baseless. They found a real mechanism. If the county approves it, You lose the easement fight without ever having it. His second assessment was more useful. But the application has to go through a public comment period, and you have standing to challenge it, and, he paused here, pulling a thick county code binder off his shelf. There are specific conditions for designation that they may not meet. Virginia's Stormwater Management Facility designation requires, among other things, that the designated land not be in active agricultural production unless the locality provides compensation or demonstrates that no feasible alternative exists. Dorothea had claimed my land was not in active production. That claim was the foundation of her application. If I could prove otherwise, loudly and publicly, the application collapsed. So I did something that felt slightly absurd, but turned out to be exactly right. I threw a harvest party. Not a small one. I printed flyers and put them up at the feed store, the diner, the library, the VFW hall. I called the 3 restaurants I supplied and asked them to mention it to their customers. I reached out to the Regional Farm Bureau. I invited the local paper, the Haywood County Recorder, which is exactly as sleepy as it sounds, but has a surprisingly good readership among the county commission. 214 people showed up on a Saturday in late November. The air was cold and clear, with that particular quality of late autumn light that makes everything look like a painting. Long shadows, golden grass, the old apple trees standing bare and skeletal against a sky the color of a good piece of slate. I had hot cider and apple butter samples. I had Walt's wife, Marjorie, running a pie contest. I had a local bluegrass duo playing near the barn. And I had, prominently displayed near the main table, a hand-lettered sign listing the orchard's current production numbers. 11,400 pounds of apples sold in the past 12 months. 3 restaurant accounts. 2 farmers' market stalls, active agricultural operation since 1971. The reporter from the Recorder, a young woman named Tess Whitmore, who turned out to be extremely good at her job, took a photograph of that sign. She also interviewed me for 45 minutes, took extensive notes, photographed the trees, and asked me, very specifically, what I thought about the HOA's drainage application. I told her, calmly, specifically, with documentation. Her story ran the following Wednesday under the headline, Historic Faulkner Orchard at Center of Disputed HOA Drainage Plan. Dorothea responded to the article by calling the paper to complain that it was one-sided and inflammatory. She sent a letter to the county planning office, characterizing the harvest event as a publicity stunt. She submitted a supplemental memo to the planning application, arguing that 1 year's production figures were insufficient to establish the character of long-term land use. That supplemental memo was a mistake, because it was a public document, and it contained, buried in a footnote, a statement that would become important later. Ridgecrest Estates maintains that its drainage proposal represents the only engineered solution to the identified stormwater problem. The only solution. Walt read that footnote at my kitchen table and laughed for about 30 seconds straight. That's not true, he said, setting down the papers. It's not even close to true. There are at least 3 other ways to manage that stormwater, and one of them is better than what she's proposing. Can you document that? I asked. He picked up his coffee. I spent 30 years documenting things. Get me graph paper. Walt produced, over the next 3 weeks, a 41-page alternative drainage analysis. He did it in the drafting room off his garage, in the evenings, on graph paper, and later transferred to CAD software with help from his grandson, who was studying civil engineering at Virginia Tech, and apparently found the project genuinely interesting as a coursework exercise. The analysis identified 3 alternative drainage routes for the Ridgecrest Estates stormwater. 2 routed through easements that could be acquired on the HOA's own adjacent undeveloped lots, land they already controlled. 1 routed through a county road right-of-way, which would require a permit but no private land acquisition at all. None of these alternatives had been mentioned in Dorothea's application. Not one. She had submitted a drainage analysis that modeled only the route through my orchard, as if my property were the sole option, and then claimed it was the only feasible solution. Breck filed a formal comment on the planning application, citing Walt's analysis, our production records, and, most importantly, a provision in the county's own stormwater management ordinance requiring that applicants demonstrate there is no feasible alternative before designating private agricultural land. Dorothea's application didn't just fail to meet that standard, It had actively concealed that alternatives existed. The planning department scheduled a public hearing. That hearing was standing room only. Walt presented his analysis using a projector borrowed from the VFW hall. Cecily testified about bee forage and the orchard's role in local pollinator habitat. 4 restaurant owners sent written statements about the economic importance of local sourcing. A retired county commissioner named Harold Voss, who had known my grandfather and had the kind of slow, deliberate authority that comes from decades in a room, stood up and said simply, "This application should never have been submitted in this form, and the board knows it." The planning board tabled the designation application, pending a review of feasible alternatives. It was, by any measure, a victory, and I should have known that a woman like Dorothea Vance does not accept a tabling as a defeat. She accepts it as a temporary delay. Because 2 months later, February, the ground frozen, the ridge above my property white and hard, I walked out one morning and found the fence line along my lower pasture had been cut. Clean diagonal cuts on 6 posts. A work crew in orange vests was staking out a line through my orchard with survey flags, moving quickly, not looking at me. Their truck had Ridgecrest Estates HOA printed on the door. I took photographs. I called Breck before I said a single word to the crew. Breck called the HOA's attorney. The HOA's attorney claimed, and I want you to appreciate the audacity here, that because the stormwater application was in review, the HOA had a reasonable basis to proceed with preliminary infrastructure work. That is not a legal standard. That is a sentence assembled from legal-sounding words to justify ignoring someone else's property rights. By noon, I had a temporary restraining order. By 3 in the afternoon, the crew was gone. But 6 of my fence posts had been cut, and 2 of my oldest apple trees, a Stamen winesap and a northern spy that had been in the ground since 1974, had had their root zones disturbed by stakes driven directly into them. One of those trees was dead by spring. 60 years of growth, gone. Breck filed for damages. The HOA's attorney sent back a letter offering $300. $300 for a tree that had produced fruit for 60 years. That was the moment I stopped defending and started planning. I had a conversation with Breck that evening that I want to describe carefully, because it is the conversation that changed everything. I laid out what I wanted to do, which was not merely to win the legal case, but to expose the entire scheme, end the designation application permanently, and ensure that Dorothea Vance never had the administrative authority to do this to another landowner again. Breck listened, drank his terrible office coffee, and said, "Everything you just described is legal. Some of it is quite clever. One part of it is extraordinarily clever. You want to hear which part?" I did. He told me about a provision in Virginia water law that I had never heard of. Most people haven't, but once you hear it, you understand why. When properly applied, it functions less like a legal argument and more like a carefully placed trap. Here is the provision. Follow me closely, because this is where the entire story turns. Under Virginia common law and codified in Section 55.1-2821 of the state code, a landowner has the right to alter the natural drainage pattern on their own property, including the right to redirect, block, or reroute surface water flows, provided they do not concentrate water onto an adjacent property in a way that causes damage beyond what would occur naturally. In plain English, I can do what I want with water on my land, as long as I'm not deliberately flooding my neighbor. Now here's the second piece. Walt's drainage analysis had done something that even I hadn't fully appreciated when he first presented it. It had precisely modeled where the water actually went if my property were no longer in the equation. What happened to the natural stormwater flow if it couldn't pass through the low point in my pasture? It went uphill. Not literally, water doesn't go uphill. But the ridge's drainage, without the natural outlet through my land, backed up and spread laterally. Specifically, it spread toward the lowest point on the other side of the HOA's development. Walt had modeled this. He had done it carefully, because he is a careful man. And what his model showed was this. If the drainage channel Dorothea proposed through my orchard were never built, if the water were instead redirected using a modest earthen berm and a series of French drains on my property toward the east, the natural flow would seek the next available outlet. That outlet was a shallow swale along the western boundary of Ridgecrest Estates' common property. A swale that, according to the community's own site plan, ran directly through the development's detention pond. A detention pond that, according to the original developer's stormwater permit, had been sized for existing drainage patterns, not for the redirected flow from an entire ridge. Walt had flagged this in his analysis, quietly, as a footnote. Alternative Route C presents engineering feasibility, though it would require the HOA to upsize its detention pond infrastructure at significant cost. Dorothea had never engaged with that footnote. I had stared at it for a long time. Breck explained what this meant legally. If the HOA had proceeded with their drainage channel through my orchard without a proper easement, they would have permanently altered the stormwater regime on my property. But under the water law provision, I, as the property owner, retain the right to redirect flows on my own land at any point, even after a channel was cut, even retroactively. So if they cut a channel through your orchard, Breck said, choosing his words carefully, and you then legally installed drainage infrastructure on your own property that redirected flows elsewhere, and that caused backflow into their detention system, could they sue you? He answered his own question. They could try, but they would have to prove that you acted maliciously, rather than exercising your legitimate property rights. And if you have documentation showing you installed drainage improvements to protect your agricultural operation, which is a completely valid reason, that defense is extraordinarily strong. He looked at me over his coffee cup. You'd need a licensed contractor, proper permits, every piece of paper documented from day one. I said, Walt's grandson is finishing his civil engineering degree in May. Breck said, then I'd start getting permits in April. What followed was 4 months of the most methodical work I have ever done in my life, and I have hand-grafted apple trees in February wind, so I know methodical. The plan had 3 components: legal, physical, financial. On the legal side, Breck filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA for the tree damage, the dead northern spy, and the disturbed wine sap, seeking actual damages plus attorney's fees under Virginia Code Section 55.1-2821.1, which allows for fee recovery in cases of intentional property interference. He also filed a formal ethics complaint with the county against Deputy Director Phil Haskell, whose "should be prepared to accommodate" letter had been written on county letterhead to support a private HOA's application. That letter, Breck noted, had no basis in county policy. Haskell had written it as a personal favor to someone on the HOA board who had gone to community college with his wife. That complaint didn't go anywhere fast, but it put Haskell on the record and made him suddenly very reluctant to issue any further informal endorsements on county stationery. On the physical side, Walt's grandson Caleb, who had in fact graduated in May and was working on his professional engineer registration, designed a stormwater management system for my lower pasture that was, on its face, exactly what it appeared to be: a series of French drains, a retention swale, and a small earthen berm, all designed to protect the orchard's root zones from excess saturation during heavy rain events. This was a legitimate agricultural drainage improvement. Orchards in Virginia suffer significant root damage from standing water, and improving subsurface drainage is a standard, documented orchard management practice. Caleb designed it to meet every county code requirement. We pulled every permit. We had the whole thing reviewed by the county's own agricultural extension office, who confirmed it was consistent with best practices for fruit tree cultivation. What the permits and the extension office review did not capture, because they were not required to capture it, was what Walt's hydrology model had predicted about where the redirected water would go downstream. That's the takeaway for anyone who wants to write this down. Legitimate property improvements, properly permitted, that happen to have downstream consequences, are legally protected as long as they don't concentrate water in a way that causes unnatural damage. The key word is concentrate. Spreading water back toward its natural secondary outlet is not concentration. In the financial column, I made one additional move that was Breck's idea, and which I consider the single most elegant component of the whole plan. I applied for and received designation as a Century Farm through the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. The Century Farm program recognizes family farms that have been in continuous agricultural operation for 100 years or more. My grandfather bought the land in 1963, which didn't quite make a century, but my great-grandfather had sharecropped the adjacent land from 1921 forward, and Breck helped document that continuous family agricultural involvement met the program's flexible interpretation of operation. Century Farm status doesn't provide legal immunity, but it provides something almost as useful. It makes a farm politically impossible to mess with. No county board member wants to be the person who approved a drainage scheme that killed a Century Farm. No planning official wants that story in the recorder. I got the Century Farm sign in July. I put it at the end of my driveway, big and green, right where anyone turning off the county road could see it. I know Dorothea drove past it. I know this because Cecily, who had excellent neighborhood intelligence, told me that Dorothea had called 2 planning board members the week after the sign went up and asked whether historical designations could be reviewed. They told her that was not a thing that could be requested by a third party. She apparently spent several minutes explaining to each of them why they were wrong. They were not wrong. Meanwhile, Caleb and a small excavation crew, working mostly on weekends, moving methodically through the lower pasture in the August heat, the diesel smell thick in the air, orange survey flags dotting the landscape, installed the drainage system over about 6 weeks. When they finished, the pasture looked better than it had in years. The trees stood on ground that was, for the first time in a decade, properly drained. The earthen berm ran along the eastern boundary, subtle and grassy, like it had always been there. Walt walked the finished system on a Sunday morning in September, hands in his pockets, checking grades with a hand level, making small sounds of approval. "How long?" I asked him. He squinted at the sky. "Depends on rainfall. Average October in this county? First significant event, and we get them in October, hard and fast off the ridge. I'd say within 24 hours of the storm starting, their detention pond would be at capacity. If the storm is long enough, you'd see overtopping." He looked at me. "Their lowest elevation homes," he said, "are in the southeast corner of the development." I already knew which ones. I had been watching them for months. October came in wet, but before October, Dorothea made one more move. And it was the move of a person who was starting to sense, even if she couldn't see the mechanism, that something had shifted. She began a campaign. Not a legal one, a social one. It started with a letter distributed to all 62 Ridgecrest Estates homeowners, written on HOA letterhead, describing what she called a neighboring property dispute that had delayed critical stormwater infrastructure and placed the community's drainage system under increased stress. She characterized my resistance as financially motivated obstruction and implied, without stating directly, that I was holding out for a large easement payment. She did not mention the trees her crew had damaged. She did not mention Walt's alternative analysis. She did not mention the ethics complaint against Haskell. That letter was, by local standards, a smear campaign. And it worked, briefly. 2 Ridgecrest homeowners who occasionally bought apples at my farm stand stopped coming. One of them left a sour review on my farm's Facebook page. A county commissioner's assistant called Breck to ask, delicately, whether there was a path to resolution, which is political language for, "Please stop making noise." Breck said there was absolutely a path to resolution. The HOA could compensate me for the damaged trees, withdraw their designation application, and engage in a legitimate easement negotiation if they still believed drainage improvements were needed. The HOA responded by hiring a new attorney, a firm out of Roanoke that specialized in HOA disputes and had a reputation for running up legal costs until smaller parties simply gave up. Their first move was a discovery request. Breck said it was designed to bury us in paperwork and cost us money. So we responded to every single item, fully, on time, with clean documentation, because we had documentation for everything, every permit, every extension office approval, every survey, every contractor invoice. When you build a trap legally, the paperwork is not your enemy, it's your best argument. Their second move was more personal. Dorothea contacted the State Agricultural Extension Office directly and requested a review of our drainage system, suggesting that it might have been installed without proper agricultural justification. The Extension Office reviewed it and confirmed, again, that it met best practices for orchard management. Their third move was the most revealing. They filed for a preliminary injunction to halt any further drainage modifications on my property, which was nonsensical because the system was already fully installed and there were no further modifications planned. Breck argued, correctly, that the injunction sought to undo permitted improvements to my own private land based on speculative future harm. The judge denied the injunction in a 15-minute hearing. After that hearing, standing in the parking lot of the county courthouse in the thin October sunlight, Breck said something that I have thought about a lot since. They've spent more on legal fees in the last 2 months than a legitimate easement negotiation would have cost. They're not trying to win the water issue anymore. They're trying to punish you for not folding when they expected you to. He was right, and people who are fighting to punish rather than to win make different decisions. Worse decisions. They push harder when they should pull back. They make noise when they should be quiet. They do not spend a lot of time checking their detention pond capacity in October. 3 days after the injunction was denied, the first significant rain event of the fall rolled in off the ridge. It came on a Thursday evening, the kind of rain that starts quiet, just a hiss on the dry leaves, then builds to a steady, determined drumming that you can feel in the floor of an old farmhouse. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching it come down. The pasture, with its new drainage system, shed water cleanly toward the east, the way Caleb had designed it. The French drains pulled subsurface flow efficiently. The berm deflected sheet flow away from the orchard root zones, toward the secondary swale that angled naturally downhill. Downhill and east, toward the ridge above Ridgecrest Estates. I did not sleep well that night. Not from guilt. I had done nothing illegal, nothing improper, nothing that wasn't documented, permitted, and consistent with standard practice. But I am not a cruel person. I would have been satisfied with the legal victory, with the injunction denial, with the ethics complaint and the Century Farm sign, and the planning board's tabling. I had not engineered this outcome with malice. I had engineered it with accuracy. Those are different things. By Friday morning, the rain was still falling. The call came at 7:14 a.m. Friday. It was not from Dorothea. It was from a Ridgecrest homeowner named Frank Alderman, who lived in the southeast corner of the development, and whose voice had the tight, controlled quality of a person who was very angry and also very wet. He said, "Did you do something to the drainage up there?" I said I had installed stormwater management improvements on my own property, with all proper permits, as I'd been legally entitled to do. He said his backyard was flooded. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said, more slowly, "Did you know this was going to happen?" I paused for exactly the right amount of time. I knew that redirecting water on my property might affect downstream drainage patterns, I said. I documented that concern in the public comment I submitted to the planning board when the HOA tried to designate my land without my consent. There was a long silence. "That comment," I said, "is public record." Another silence. "I'll send you the page number," I said. He hung up. I imagine he went and looked it up. By mid-morning, I knew what was happening at Ridgecrest. Cecily called with updates at 30-minute intervals, with the cheerful precision of a woman who had been attending planning meetings for 3 years and felt appropriately vindicated. The detention pond had reached capacity around midnight. By 4 a.m., it had overtopped into the community's low drainage swale. By dawn, the swale had channeled water into the backyards of the 12 homes in the southeast corner. No basements flooded, the development was slab on grade, but patios were submerged. 2 landscaping retaining walls had failed, and the pickleball court, somewhat poetically, was under about 4 inches of water. Dorothea had been on the phone since 5 a.m. She had called the HOA's new Roanoke attorneys, who told her there was nothing they could do before the weekend. She had called the county stormwater office, who told her that the Faulkner property's drainage improvements had been permitted and reviewed. She had called Prescott Langley's development company, who had a policy of not answering calls before 9 a.m. on Fridays. She had not called me. At 10 a.m., she knocked on my door. I had been expecting this. I opened it before she finished knocking. She was not wearing her lanyard. I noticed that specifically. I'd never seen her without it. She had mud on her shoes. Her polo shirt was damp at the shoulders. The clipboard was there, but she was holding it flat against her body, rather than presenting it, which was not her usual posture. "You did this," she said. "Good morning," I said. "You redirected that water on purpose." I installed a stormwater management system on my own property, with permits, to protect my orchard. You knew what it would do. I knew what my engineer predicted it might do under certain rainfall conditions. I disclosed that prediction in a public planning comment. "Would you like the document number?" Her jaw moved. She was recalibrating. I could see it. She was trying to find the angle that would work, the tone that would shake something loose. "Those are people's homes," she said. And for just a moment, the bureaucratic armature dropped, and there was a real person behind it, genuinely distressed, not calculating. I felt something, not regret. What she'd done to my trees, my grandfather's trees, didn't leave room for regret, but something human. "Yes," I said, "they are. And they never should have been put in a position where their drainage infrastructure was undersized because the developer was counting on routing excess capacity through my private land. The people in those houses didn't make that decision. You did. Prescott Langley did." She stood there in the rain. "What do you want?" she said finally. I told her. Full compensation for the damaged trees, withdrawal of the designation application, and a legitimate easement negotiation at fair market value if drainage improvements were still desired, with a licensed engineer, documented alternatives, and no more informal county letters. She nodded once, barely. "I'll have the attorney call Breck," she said. She walked back to her car. I watched her go. The rain had slackened to a drizzle, and the air smelled like clean, wet clay and the last of the fall apples, sweet and slightly fermented, the same smell it always is when things are ending and something else is beginning. I closed the door. I made more coffee. The private settlement between me and Dorothea might have been the end of it, except that the story had already escaped into the world, and worlds, once alerted to a good story, tend to finish them publicly, whether or not the principals want them to. The flooding at Ridgecrest Estates was covered by Tess Whitmore in the Haywood County Recorder, whose readership, as I mentioned, is surprisingly robust. Her story was precise and damaging. She had Walt's alternative drainage analysis, which had been submitted as a public planning comment. She had the minutes of the public hearing. She had the ethics complaint against Haskell, which had recently been substantiated in a quiet county review. Haskell had received a written reprimand and been reassigned away from development review, which was about as dramatic as county administrative discipline gets. She had the injunction denial. She had the Century Farm designation. And she had the flooding photographs, which were extraordinary. The pickleball court under 4 inches of water, rackets floating in the corner. A retaining wall made of expensive imported stone collapsed into a soup of mulch and October mud. A backyard patio with a wrought iron patio set, standing in water up to the seat cushions. The detention pond, designed for one rainfall regime, trying to handle another. A thin, silver sheet of water spreading steadily toward the manicured lawns of a community that had believed its infrastructure was someone else's problem. Tess's story ran online Thursday evening and in print Friday morning. By Saturday, it had been shared 1,600 times on Facebook. By Sunday, it had been picked up by a regional outlet in Roanoke. By Monday, a reporter from Richmond had called Breck. The county commission held an emergency session the following Tuesday to discuss stormwater management practices and the use of informal designation procedures. That meeting was, technically, a procedural review. In practice, it was a public accounting. Dorothea was not on the HOA board by the time the meeting convened. She had submitted her resignation by email Sunday evening, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on her home. 2 other board members resigned the same day. The board's remaining members hired a professional property management company to handle HOA administration, which is what they should have done in 2018 when the community was founded, instead of handing the gavel to Dorothea Vance. Prescott Langley appeared at the county commission meeting in person, wearing a fleece vest and the expression of a man who had read the same email chain about 45 times in the past week. He announced that his development company would fund an independent engineering review of Ridgecrest Estates' stormwater infrastructure and commit to implementing whatever improvements were identified at the development company's cost, not the HOA's. When commissioners pressed him on whether that commitment was legally binding, he said yes. When one commissioner asked why his original development plan had sized the detention pond based on a drainage route through private land his company did not own, he said, "That was an oversight in our planning process that we take full responsibility for." Oversight is a very polite word for what it was. Deputy Director Phil Haskell was not at the meeting. He had, as noted, been reassigned. I attended the meeting. I sat in the back row with Walt, Cecily, and Breck, and I did not speak during public comment because I had already said what I needed to say, in document form, months ago. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a public proceeding in which every piece of evidence presented was already filed by you in advance, in the correct format, with the correct citations. The mic drop moment, if there was one, came from Harold Voss, the retired commissioner, who rose during public comment and said, in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who remembers when this county operated differently, "This entire situation could have been avoided if someone had knocked on Garrett Faulkner's door, sat at his kitchen table, and talked to him like a neighbor. That's how we used to do things. That's how we should still do them. The law didn't fix this. Common decency, applied late, barely fixed it. Let's remember that." The room was quiet for a moment after he sat down. Then people started clapping. Not a lot of people, but enough. The settlement was signed in November, 12 months after the harvest party, 2 months after the flood. Dorothea's HOA, under its new professional management, compensated me $14,200 for the 2 damaged trees, based on a tree appraisal methodology called the trunk formula technique, which calculates the value of a mature tree based on species, size, condition, and location. That's a real calculation method, used by arborists and accepted in court. Trees are worth more than $300. Prescott Langley's company paid for a proper easement appraisal and offered $8,500 for a limited drainage easement along my property's eastern boundary. The eastern boundary, not through the orchard. Walt's grandson Caleb designed the new drainage channel over 6 weeks. It routed water through an existing low point that required minimal grading, tied into the upsized detention pond, and left my apple trees untouched. The northern spy was still dead. You don't get that back. But the following spring, Caleb helped me plant 2 new trees in its place. A different variety, a Newtown Pippin, which is a colonial-era apple that tastes like nothing so much as cold autumn air, and something you can't quite name. It'll take 10 years to produce a meaningful crop. That's fine. My grandfather planted trees he knew he wouldn't see in full production. I can do the same. The stormwater improvements at Ridgecrest were completed the following summer. The 12 flooded homeowners each received a settlement from Langley's development company covering landscape and hardscape repair. The pickleball court was resurfaced. I'm told it's still a source of conflict. Tess Whitmore at the Recorder won a Virginia Press Association award for local reporting for her coverage of the dispute. She accepted it graciously and immediately began investigating a separate zoning issue in the next county over. I hope she never stops. Phil Haskell took early retirement in February. I have no particular feelings about that. The ethics review process his case went through resulted in the county adopting a new policy. Any informal letter of support issued by a county official for a private party's planning application must be approved by the county attorney's office before distribution. That is a small reform, but small reforms, documented, applied consistently, are how large problems get quieter over time. As for the orchard, we had a good year. 11,400 pounds of apples, same as the sign said. The drainage improvements, if I'm honest, actually helped. The lower pasture root zones are healthier than they've been in a decade, and Caleb's French drains have kept the soil profile exactly where it should be through a wet spring and a wet fall. In December, I started something I've been meaning to do for years, a scholarship. The Earl Faulkner Agricultural Scholarship, in my grandfather's name, awarded annually to a Haywood County student pursuing a degree in agriculture, horticulture, or environmental science. The first award is $2,000, seeded with a portion of the tree settlement, and I've got commitments from 2 local businesses and one of the restaurant owners to contribute annually. Earl Faulkner was a postal worker who bought a piece of rocky Virginia hillside and spent 20 years turning it into something that fed his neighbors and outlasted him. He never went to college. He would have found a scholarship in his name probably a little embarrassing and secretly wonderful. I think about that sometimes, when I'm out in the orchard early in the morning, coffee in hand, the air smelling of soil and bark, and whatever the season has brought, the trees standing in their rows the way they always have, older and more patient than anything I've built or argued for or won.
So that's what happened. Dorothy came for an orchard. She left without a board seat, without an easement, and without an explanation that's held up in any room that matters. Here's what I keep coming back to. She wasn't wrong that water runs downhill. She was wrong about who has the right to decide where it went. Garrett didn't win because he got lucky. He won because he did one thing most people skip. He read the document. Then he found someone who understood the document better than the person weaponizing it. Then he waited. That's not a legal trick. That's just preparation beating impatient. Petty authorities has one real weakness. It's assume you won't do the homework. Do the homework. If you ever had someone show up with a clipboard and act like your property was theirs to manage, you know exactly how Gareth felt at 6 a.m. with that backhoe in his orchard. And if you haven't yet, save this video, because HOA boards don't pick fights with people who are ready. Drop a comment. What's the most absurd thing an HOA has ever tried to push on you or someone you know? If this one hit right, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe. New story every week. And remember, the trees they cut down, Gareth planned to more.